Today's lesson is The Duplicity of Hargreaves. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike.
And I'm Candice.
And I don't like Hargreaves because he is duplicitous. Ooh, there's a longer version of that word, duplicity. When we talk about duplicity, we're talking about being tricky, being deceitful, making people think one thing when another thing might be true. If you're a con artist, if you're committing fraud of some kind, if you're lying to someone, there will be some duplicity involved because you are being duplicitous. You are being dishonest, tricky, and sneaky for some reason. That's why I don't like Hargreaves, but I don't know anything about Hargreaves. Are you familiar with this story?
Well, I had a read through the story, and I have a little bit of an idea of his character. And I agree with you. He's not someone to be trusted. Okay. He is dishonest. Ooh. And another word that we often use when we think someone is duplicitous, we sometimes say that they're two-faced.
Two-faced,
yeah,
sneaky.
So,
we have a lot of words for that, don't we?
Yeah, there are lots of words, and I think it's because we encounter these situations often in life, and we have to be able to discern who is duplicitous, who shows duplicity, and who is, in fact, acting in an honest manner.
And let's find out all about the duplicity of Hargreaves as we read the first part of our article. The Duplicity of Hargreaves. Once a rich and powerful Southern gentleman, old Major Talbot had fallen on hard times after the war. He and his daughter Lydia moved north to Washington, D.C., and rented a room they could barely afford in a pleasant old boarding house. There, the Major spent nearly all his time working on an autobiography about his days on the plantation, while Lydia struggled with their financial affairs.
大家好，第一部分我们看到单字 autobiography， 这个字是名词，指自传，像是 When famous people retire, they usually write an autobiography. 当名人退休时，他们通常会写自传，或是 The politician wrote his views about the former government in his autobiography. 那位政治家在自传中写下了他对前政府的看法。另外补充这个字的形容词 autobiographical。autobiographical, autobiographical, 表示自传的。举例来说 The film is an autobiographical story of the director as a young boy. 这部电影是那位导演年轻时的自传故事。也可以说 The author's recent novel is mostly autobiographical in that he shares many real-life experiences with his main character. 该作家最新的小说大多为自传性的，他与主角共享许多他的真实经历。接着我们看到名词 plantation， 它的意思是种植园或是大农场。例如 In the southern parts of the country, you can still find very large cotton plantations. 在该国南部，你仍然可以找到非常大的棉花种植园。或者 We took a tour of the pineapple plantation to see how pineapples are grown. 我们参观了凤梨农场，看看凤梨是如何种植的。另外补充这个字的动词 plant, P-L-A-N-T, plant, 指种植。像是 My mother planted some flowers in the garden. 我妈妈在花园里种了一些花。也可以说 I planted that seed when I was little, and now it has grown into a tall tree. 我小时候种下了那颗种子，现在它长成了一棵高大的树。
And we are back, so there you go. We haven't actually met Hargreaves yet. We've met a few other characters, so let's see how this story all begins. It says, Once a rich and powerful Southern gentleman, old Major Talbot had fallen on hard times after the war. Okay, so a good beginning to a classic American tale. We know it's American because this character, Major Talbot, is described as a Southern gentleman. Hi, I am a Southern gentleman. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. This probably means that this man had something to do with the Civil War. He fought for the South in the gray uniforms, fighting for slavery. We see the capital S there in Southern. That gives us the idea he was on the side of the South, the Confederates, the gray guys against the North, the Union, the blue guys in that big American war from 1861 to 1865 that we call the U.S. Civil War. And he was in the Army. He was a major in the Army. This is a rank in the Army, like a captain or a colonel. I believe actually major is between captain and colonel. The major might command a couple hundred different soldiers on the field. They are leading their soldiers in battle. But that was a long time ago. He's described as old Major Talbot. So this is probably the late 1800s. He's a much older man, and life hasn't gone so well for him since those glory days fighting in the war. He's fallen on hard times. To fall on hard times means, well, probably economically, but maybe in other parts of your life, you're not having a lot of luck. Things are pretty difficult. If you lose your job, your rent goes up, your bills still need to be paid, you have to borrow money from all your friends, you're selling your furniture to buy food, really tough times, hard times. To fall on hard times means to sort of move into a period of life where things are really, really tough for you.
Yes, and I think that must have been especially difficult for old Major Talbot because he was a very proud man and he had lived a life where he was respected. And so to fall on hard times must have really disturbed his sense of order, the order of the world. And
True.
Of course, when you're older, he was dependent on his daughter to help him. So he and his daughter, Lydia, moved north to Washington, D.C. and rented a room they could barely afford in a pleasant old boarding house. So this must have been the story for many people who fell on hard times. They had to leave behind their homes and then move into different accommodations, something not quite as capital intense. They needed to downscale so that they could afford a place to live. And where they moved to was in Washington, D.C. They moved to the north, which is completely different from the south. And they moved into an old boarding house. So a boarding house is shared housing. So they would have had a room or maybe a few rooms inside a larger house that other people were sharing. And according to the article, it was a pleasant old boarding house, but they could barely afford it. So something else that people always talk about is when people fall on hard times, they lose their money, but they still want to maintain a certain standard of living. So they were living in probably what we would consider genteel poverty. So they lived in this old boarding house, and Lydia was right there with her father. There, the major spent nearly all of his time working on an autobiography about his days on the plantation, while Lydia struggled with their financial affairs. So the old man was reliving his glory days, writing his autobiography. An autobiography, of course, is a story about your life. Usually we assume that they are facts about your life. And the major's autobiography was about his days on the plantation. The plantation, of course, is a large farm. Now, in the South, these plantations were mainly for cash crops. So they would grow things like cotton or coffee or tea or sugar cane. Not so much food. It wasn't really for food. It was mainly for cash crops. So when we think about the South, we often think about cotton crops. And while he was writing his autobiography, of course, Lydia was left to struggle with their financial affairs. So she was left to figure out what to do about the fact that they had no money.
That's right. Of course, those big plantations in the South, the other thing about them is they were mainly staffed and worked by slaves. So the owner of the plantation, someone like Major Talbot and his family, would have owned probably hundreds of slaves who would have done all the work on the plantation, while Major Talbot and the others collected the profit. So that, of course, is the system of slavery they had in the South. But times have changed, and so Major Talbot and his daughter Lydia need to change with the times, and it's been hard. So let's find out more about them as we read the second part of today's article. Another resident of the boarding house, Henry Hargraves, soon took an interest in the Major. As an ambitious young actor skilled in comedy, he was always looking for new sources of inspiration, and he found exactly that in the old man. It became a custom for Hargreaves to sit with the Major each afternoon and listen with enthusiasm as he read from his memoir and told tales about the old days. The Major went into great detail about names and dates, and Hargreaves eagerly asked him many questions.
第二部分我们看到单字 enthusiasm， 这个字是名词，指热忱或是热情。举例来说 Rebecca has a lot of enthusiasm for the work that she does. Rebecca 对她所从事的工作充满热忱。或是 I don't have much enthusiasm for parades these days. I think they're too noisy. 我现在对游行没有太多热情，我认为太吵了。另外补充这个字的形容词 enthusiastic， E-N-T-H-U-S-I-A-S-T-I-C enthusiastic， 它的意思是热情的或是热烈的。例如 The enthusiastic crowd cheered the home team. 热情的群众为主场队欢呼。或者 The fans were enthusiastic to see the band's concert. 粉丝们热衷于看那个乐团的演唱会。
All right, we are back. So, Major Talbot and his daughter Lydia had to move up to Washington, D.C. as someone who fought for the South against the Union, which, of course, was centered in Washington. That's where Abraham Lincoln, who, led the Union during the war, that must have been a little difficult, possibly, right? You're sort of moving to the main city of your enemy after you fought this war. He's a proud Southerner. It must have been a real difficult decision to move there to Washington, but they couldn't afford to live on their farm, on their plantation anymore, so that's where they've gone. And in this boarding house, in this place they're now living in Washington, D.C., they meet another person. It says another resident of the boarding house, Henry Hargreaves, soon took an interest in the Major. All right, so, if you stay in a B&B or in a hotel, you might chat with other people who are staying there and maybe develop a friendship or something like that. This is what's happening there, and we know Henry Hargreaves is living there because he's a resident. A resident is a person who lives in a place. You are a resident of your home, your house, your apartment. We are residents of Taiwan. You can be a resident of a city if you live in that place. If you're not visiting or just traveling through, but that is where you call home, then you are a resident. And who was Henry Hargreaves?
Well, Henry Hargreaves was an ambitious young actor. It says, as an ambitious young actor skilled in comedy, he was always looking for new sources of inspiration, and he found exactly that in the old man. So he was an actor, and he was looking for different material that he could use in his act. And it says he was looking for new sources of inspiration. And in meeting the old Major, who was from the South, had certain mannerisms, had a strong Southern accent, wore his Major's uniform with pride, Henry Hargreaves thought, okay, this is an idea for a character that I would like to create. So he modeled a character on the old man. But it says he was skilled in comedy. So we have to think about what comedy is. Comedy is about making people laugh. So you can make jokes, or you can use physical humor or physical expression to make other people laugh. So what they're saying is that he's going to use the old man as a character to be laughed at in a comedy. All right, so that's what happens next.
Very, very interesting. So he's kind of doing research. He's using the Major to sort of learn how to play this character better. It became a custom, it says, for Hargreaves to sit with the Major each afternoon and listen with enthusiasm as he read from his memoir and told tales about the old days. So there you go. You can imagine Hargreaves as sort of an enthusiastic young person trying to learn as much wisdom and other things he can from this older person. So it became a custom, became a habit, became something they did every day, maybe after lunch or something, to sit with the Major in the afternoon and listen with enthusiasm as he read from his memoir. So Hargreaves is listening with great interest, and when you do something with enthusiasm, you do it with excitement, with passion, with a really positive attitude, like this is going to be great. I really want to do this. I can't wait. So he wasn't bored. He wasn't there like, oh God, I wish he'd shut up, or yawning or something like that. Oh, please tell me more, Major. And then what happened? And, he really wants to hear more. And he's hearing a lot of the personal history of Major Talbot because the Major is reading from his memoir. We might also say memoirs. You could put an S on that because this is basically the story of your life, kind of collected maybe almost in a diary form as you were living. And you collect all those books, all those old diaries, you save them, and then years later, you kind of go back. And if you want to write your own biography, your autobiography, your memoirs will be a good way of starting. But you might want to edit it down because a memoir might be like too much information. And then on Tuesday, I went to Joe's house and we played poker for 3 hours. Some of that stuff in a memoir might not make it into a biography or autobiography, a more official story of a person's life, but it is very, very similar. And it's a good place to go back and find those tales about the old days. In other words, stories from your past, hopefully interesting stories from your past.
Yes, and of course, memoir is just another word for memories. So he writes down his memories, and the Major went into great detail about names and dates, and Hargreaves eagerly asked him many questions. So, of course, the Major, in the face of all of this enthusiasm from Hargreaves, thinks, okay, Hargreaves is really interested in my story, so I'm going to go into a lot of detail. I'm going to tell him what he's interested in. And so he talks about people, and he talks about events, and he talks about dates, and of course, Hargreaves pumps him for more and more information. He asks questions.
Exactly right. I don't see a lot of duplicity yet, but we've only just begun. So let's take a break and we'll hear more in the final paragraph of our story. After several months, Lydia informed the Major that they were out of money. And while the Major had finally finished his book, he had been unable to find a publisher. Even worse, he had spent their last $2 on tickets to a play.
最后第3部分我们看到单字 publisher 这个字是名词，指出版商或是出版社，像是 Nathan is looking for a publisher for his book about cats. Nathan 正在为他那本关于猫的书找出版商，或是The author sent the first draft of his new novel to his publisher for a review. 那位作家把他新的小说初稿寄给出版社审阅。另外补充这个字的动词 publish, P-U-B-L-I-S-H, publish, 指出版或是发行。例如 The magazine was first published in 1942. 那本杂志最早是在1942年出版的。也可以说Caesar published his first collection of poetry 5 years ago. Caesar 在5年前发行了他的第一本诗集。
Okay, we are back. So, Henry Hargreaves has had a pretty good time getting to know Major Talbot at the boarding house they're both sharing in Washington, D.C., and he's learning a lot from the Major about life as a real old Southern gentleman from back in the old days. So this is good because Hargreaves, of course, is a young actor, and he's using this, right? He's using this to sort of make his acting better and make his portrayals more realistic and stuff. So some time passed. We get that feeling. And then as we get back to the article, we read, after several months, Lydia informed the Major that they were out of money. And while the Major had finally finished his book, he had been unable to find a publisher. Oh, this is not good. They've already had some tough times. They've fallen on hard times. In other words, money was already a worry and a problem. But after staying at this boarding house and not really making much money while still spending money, to pay for rent, for example, the daughter of the Major tells him that they're out of money. They're broke. There's nothing left in their bank account and all that. So the major has finished his book. Remember those memoirs? He was probably, editing them down, writing a biography. He hoped to get people to read it and publish it and buy it. That didn't happen. He was unable to find a publisher. A publisher or a publishing company is basically a company. It's usually not a person, but a publisher will work for a publishing company, or we can call the whole business a publisher. But these are the people who print newspapers and books and magazines and get them out into the store and that kind of thing. So when you buy a book by your favorite author, you might see on the side of the book or in the front page or something that says Random House or Penguin or something like that. That's the publisher. That's the company that actually prints the book. But if you don't have a publisher, you're just a person walking around with a bunch of pages of your writing. It's not a proper book until a publisher actually prints it in a book form and gets it out to the shops. So they have a few money issues.
Yes, and so, of course, Lydia is worried because, as you say, they're out of money.
They could get kicked out and have to sleep on the street.
That's right. That would have been quite a disaster for an old man and a young woman at that time. Of course, he's unable to find a publisher. And, of course, a publisher is the link between the writer and the public. So if you can't find a publisher, even if you have a great book, if nobody publishes that book, you can't make any money off it.
It's like a movie studio or a record company or something. Otherwise, you're just selling it directly to the public, which is not easy.
That's right. Yeah, I think today we do a lot of, there are people who do self-publishing, but that is also incredibly challenging because the way the system is structured, it's still very much structured for the person to provide their material, whether that be music or writing, to a publishing house, and that publishing house is the intermediary. It's the link between, so that they can get that information or that music out to the public.
Exactly.
Right. And then what was even worse than the fact that they were out of money, the major had been a little bit careless with their last money. Even worse, he had spent the last $2 on tickets to a play.
Ooh, yeah. When you're struggling to pay for your rent or food, you don't want to be buying theater tickets. But then again, these tickets might be to go see Henry Hargraves. Remember that aspiring young actor? Who knows? Well, we're going to have to find out more about all of this in tomorrow's story. So don't go away. Come back for that. But for now, it's time to go over to our Chinese teacher.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。首先看到课文标题是 The Duplicity of Hargraves。 那么其中这个 duplicity 它是名词，表示欺骗或者是搞两面派啊，口是心非的那种意思。那我们来学习它的字首字根。当我们看到 plex 或者是 ple 或是 plic 或是 pli 还有 ploy 或者是 ply， 好，这一类的字根呢，它们表示折叠、对折或是交错等等的意思。那么在 duplicity 这个字当中，它的字首 du 表示 two， 也就是二或者是双。那么字根 plic 表示 fold， 就是折叠，然后 ity 是名词字尾。所以我们从字首字根来看啊，它就带有 twofold 的那种语义，那就表示有两部分的，有两方面的。当一个人他的行为有两面，这样应该不难联想到 duplicity 它有口是心非啊，搞两面派的那种意思了。好，那我们顺便补充几个有这一类字根的单字。第一个是 explicit， 它的字首 ex 表示向外，那么字根 plic 表示折叠，it 则是形容词字尾。那么向外折叠我们可以怎么联想呢？假设你有很多这种同颜色的 T-shirt， 如果你把正面图案都向外折叠，这样你一打开衣柜抽屉，是不是就一目了然？你可以清楚知道哪个图案就是你要的。所以我们可以从那种向外折叠可以看得一清二楚，去联想到 explicit， 它表示清楚明白、明确表达的、毫不掩饰的或是露骨的。那么它的相反字是把 ex 改成 im 变成 implicit， 它表示不明说的或者是含蓄的。好，再来第二个补充的是 perplex， P-E-R-P-L-E-X。 那它的字首 PER 表示完全，那么字根 PLEX 表示交叠。同学们可以试着联想，当你所有思绪完全交叠在一起，完全缠绕在一起的时候，就会感到很困惑，所以 perplex 这个动词就表示使困惑，使费解。好，在第三个补充的是 deploy，它的字首 DE 表示否定或是相反，字根 PLOY 表示折叠。那其实 deploy 它字源的意思就是 unfold， 那就表示有展开啊、展示的意思，所以 deploy 就表示展开或是部署。它可以用来表达像降落伞的展开啊、人力物资的调派啊，或者是军队的部署等等。那么课文第二部分，它有介绍技术公寓的另一名住客是 Henry Hargreaves， 介绍他出场。那么文中用到的名词是 resident， 来表达居民啊、住户或是居住者，它是来自动词 reside。我们也来拆解它的字首字根。当我们看到 RE 这个字首呢，它表示以前、再度，那么字根 SIDE 它就有 sit 坐的意思，从以前呢就一直坐在那边、待在那边、存在于某处，用这样的方式也许就可以联想到 reside 它有居住、定居或是存在于点点点的意思。那我们在 reside 后面接名词字尾 ENT， 这个 ENT 就表示执行某事的人，所以呢我们去执行居住、执行定居的人，应该就可以联想到 resident 它表示居民、住户了。好，以上是今天重点整理，我们来回顾今天的单字吧。
Autobiography. The famous fighter pilot's autobiography included many exciting stories. Resident. Our school's English teacher is a resident of Taiwan, but a citizen of Canada. Comedy. Joan was so good at making her friends laugh that they encouraged her to go into comedy. Enthusiasm. The hotel's manager greets every guest with great enthusiasm. Publisher. The publisher paid the young novelist a huge sum for his novel. Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Mike.
I'm Candice.
See you next time.